Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 2024 Blackham Lecture. My name is Ginny Smith. I'm a science writer and presenter with a special interest in neuroscience and psychology, and I'm also a patron of Humanists UK. So tonight marks the final entry in the Humanists UK's 2024 annual lecture series, and we're delighted to be joined by all of you here online. And hello also to those of you joining York Humanists and Leicester Humanists at one of their live screenings. It's great to have you here today. In case you don't know, Humanists UK is a national charity working on behalf of non-religious people. Powered by over 130,000 members and supporters, we advance free thinking and promote humanism to create a tolerant society where rational thinking and kindness prevail, or at least we're trying. We provide ceremonies, pastoral care, education, and support services, which benefit over 1 million people every year. And our campaigns advance humanist thinking on ethical issues, human rights, and equal treatment for all. If tonight's event is your first time coming across Humanists UK and our work, I'd encourage you to visit the website humanists.uk, but don't do it right now. Wait till after the event because you don't want to miss Brenna's wonderful talk. So we're going to have a chance for Q&A towards the end of tonight's event. The Q&A box should be open throughout the whole talk, so please do drop your questions in as you go along, and the earlier you get them in, the better. We're not going to be able to get through everyone's questions, unfortunately, but it's always particularly sad when there's a huge rush of really excellent questions in the last 5 minutes because it means we can't get to them. So do get them in early if you can. Please do bear in mind, though, that we might not read it immediately. So try and make sure that it will make sense if we come back to it 20 minutes, 30 minutes later. So just saying something like, can you explain that a bit more? We're not going to know what you're talking about. So try and make sure it'll make sense when we come back to it later. Okay, so on to tonight, the Blackham Lecture Series. This explores an aspect of education, childhood, or lifelong development, either philosophical, practical, or social, that relates to humanism. And the Blackham medalist has made a significant contribution in one of these fields. The lecture and medal are named after the educationist and activist Harold Blackham, the first executive director of Humanists UK and the first general secretary of Humanists International. And our 2024 Blackham lecturer here with me tonight is Brenna Hassett. Brenna, I've never done that before. Met you loads of times. Of course it would be now. I bet loads of people do that. Sorry. Brenna is a biological anthropologist whose career has taken her around the globe, researching the past using the clues left behind in human remains. She has a PhD from University College London, where she's currently a researcher, and she's also scientific associate at the Natural History Museum in London. She specialises in using clues from the human skeleton to understand how people lived and died in the past. Her research focuses on the evidence of health and growth locked into teeth to investigate how children grew, or didn't grow, across the world and across time. Her first book, Built on Bones, 15,000 Years of Urban Life and Death, was well received by critics at the LA Times, The Guardian, and The Times, which named it as one of the top 10 science books of the year. She followed this up with Growing Up Human, The Evolution of Childhood in 2022. Brenna is a founding member of the Trailblazers project, dedicated to increasing the visibility of women in the digging sciences, which I think is a great phrase. I love that. So we're delighted to have her here tonight for her Blackham lecture, Growing Up Human, The Evolution of Childhood. So I'll hand it over to you now. Welcome, Brenna.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming and giving your time to what is perhaps a niche interest, but I hope I can convince everyone that actually the story of our childhood is probably one of the most interesting things that you could possibly think about. So I'm Brenna Hassett. I'm actually now at the University of Central Lancashire. I moved. But here I am. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the study of how we grow. And I use my sort of scientific techniques about this, but I have to say that the story of this lecture is one about rational thinking and bringing science to bear on real world issues. This was a book I wrote because I wanted to know exactly what happened to humans when they had babies, because I was about to have one. And this is the result. So I hope that everyone will enjoy a small trip through what is perhaps the strangest thing any species has ever done, which is have children, like human children. First things first, I'm always asked, what do I mean by a child? There's a lot of definitions. There's legal definitions, social definitions. Who would you give a car loan to? Who would you allow in a rental car? Who's over 18? What all of those definitions have in common, though, is that they're very different all over the globe. So what I'm talking about is childhood as the period where you're a net sink. Resources are being poured into you, and that is what a child is for humans. They're an investment. Lots of people putting a lot of effort in. There are very different ways to be children, and of course humans have chosen the weirdest one. That is our specialty. From a sort of evolutionary biology standpoint, we can look at different milestones in life and think about how we invest in them. And different animals have very, very different strategies. We have animals that take longer or shorter to actually grow their babies internally. And we usually have the words altricial and precocial to talk about animals that are born ready or not ready. People always say that human babies are not born quite ready because they're ridiculous, they're useless, they're helpless. But of course, they're not as bad as kittens or puppies. At least we have our eyes open and our ears open when we're born. Then we have things like infancy, the period of infancy, where you're mostly being taken care of by one person, if you're a mammal, and that's the person giving you milk. And we have special adaptations like milk to help some animals get even more investment in that crucial infant period. Something like a poor little spider who doesn't get mother's milk is off and running from the get-go, whereas mammals have something like lovely milk to offer. Then we have different ways of investing in growth. Should you sprint to the finish? Should you go and get big really quickly? Or should you take a long time? These are different strategies, and as we'll see, humans have definitely opted for one of them. And of course, there's the investments that we put into reproduction and maturity, and that switch from being invested in to doing the investing. So we'll sort of look at those as milestones as we go through. But this is what I mean when I'm talking about investment and picking out the very peculiar human strategy. This is an ancient slide, and please don't get mad, any evolutionary biologists in the audience. This is a concept called R versus K, sort of life history. It's very old-fashioned, and we wouldn't use it in a sort of evolutionary biology context because it doesn't take into account lots of different things. But it's a very useful tool for thinking about the overall strategies that different animals might have. So that spider, if you think of Charlotte's Web as a classic American children's book, and Charlotte has babies, and of course the mother is not around when thousands and thousands of perfectly formed little baby spiders, only growing in size, no growing up to do. That is something where it's sort of a shotgun approach to reproduction. The assumption there is you don't invest a lot in each individual baby, but you have a lot of babies, and that's going to see your species through. The exact opposite is the human strategy, which is you don't have that many babies, especially compared to a spider, but you really, really invest in them. You invest huge amounts of resources, and you particularly take a very long time doing it. We are so expensive to grow. I'm sorry for the number of numbers on this slide. I feel like the humanists might be an audience who would at least enjoy numbers. But if you think about us, even compared to our closest biological relatives, the other great apes, we are so expensive to grow. Something like 313 calories a day is what it costs to grow a baby. A chimpanzee, not even close. 184, a gorilla, 218, an orangutan, 194. These are big investments for the animal kingdom. Great apes have very big brains compared to the rest of them. And, they also take a long time to be born and grow and get ready, but they're nothing like a human. And one of the clues to why that is in that big number next to the grams of brain. We're talking something like 400 in the rest of the great apes, and then we triple it to 1,200 grams of very expensive brain to grow in a human. And so we actually grow quite slow. If you think about a human next to a chimpanzee is a little bit smaller, but our childhoods are very different lengths. This is, I've studied skeletons, so of course you're getting skeleton pictures. This is an illustration of a chimpanzee. You can guess which one that is. And human. And the little numbers next to them are the ages at which that part of the body stops growing. So you can see, for instance, we've got the shoulder. So this is all of the pieces of your shoulder, your humerus, your scapula, your clavicle, are sort of fusing into a sort of solid joint, particularly the humerus and the end of the humerus, at about 9 or 10 years of age for a chimpanzee. And that's something like 19 years for a male human, a little bit earlier in female humans. So we actually physically grow so much slower than our nearest relatives. We have to start and ask, why is that? This is how we tell this story. This is how particularly my discipline tells this story, bones and teeth. So I'm a biological anthropologist. I look at bodies in the past. I have a sideline in archaeology. You're going to get a lot of that. Sorry, I love archaeology. But this is how our bodies grow. Your body actually has a sort of unfinished state. And if we are to go off and excavate, for instance, a hominin fossil, or any other animal that grows like this, we can tell how old it is just by looking at how finished the bones are. So this is humerus, so this is that arm bone again. And you can see it starts off at birth and it's just a stick with a little end. That end is slowly going to form into a proper shape and form the ball socket that's going to sit firmly in our arm. This is the same thing that happens with chimpanzees at 9 to 10 years, and us something like 16 to 19. So you can see this process slowly going. More importantly, we're researching how this happened in our evolutionary past. We can see this in the fossil record. We also have teeth. I am very evangelical about teeth, for which I refuse to apologize. They are excellent. Teeth are like living fossils in your mouth. It's an exceptional resource for people like me who are interested in growth, because your teeth grow once. It's not like a bone. A bone, if you break it, it's sort of terrible, but it will grow, it will knit itself back together. There's active bone activity that's going to knit that bone together. What happens if you chip a tooth? You're looking at a crown, it's very expensive, and if I'd gone into proper dentistry, well, I wouldn't be getting this lecture, would I? Be on my yacht. But what it does tell us is how a child grew, and the lovely thing about teeth is they grow really regularly. We know exactly, more or less, how teeth work and how they appear in the mouth. So this is a little atlas, and this is what the inside of your mouth looks like as you're growing up. And as you can see, it's basically a series of sharks. Small children are sharks. They have multiple rows of teeth. They have their baby teeth and then their big teeth growing behind them. And because this happens in such a regular way in our species, we can actually work out what age you are from your teeth. So we want to know, how did we get this way? Our slow growing selves with a heavy investment. And for this, we can start to look at hominid fossil record. So it's not very common. We don't have a lot of fossils. It takes a lot of effort to make yourself into a fossil. Falling into a mud pit, super useful. Of course, did not happen all that often. Being lost at the bottom of a cave system that sort of gets covered with a lot of sediment, also a good call. But we do have a handful of incredibly important fossils of juvenile hominids. So these are probably ancestral. No one wants to say anything for sure, but these are probably ancestral to our species, so our ancestors. We have Australopithecus africanus, so Lucy. For those of you who remember Lucy, she's the most famous version. But there is a child fossil, the tongue child. It's found by Raymond Dart in South Africa. Was found by someone blowing up a bunch of dirt for a mine. But Raymond Dart recognized it and lovingly chipped this jaw out of breccia with knitting needles upstairs in his study. And from this jaw, you can see that the teeth are at different stages. Just like when a modern child is losing their teeth and getting the new ones in, we can actually look and see what stages they are. We can do x-rays and see inside what stage of growth these are. So we see the tongue child's jaw, and if they were human, they'd fit on our giant atlas of shark teeth at 6 years old. So that's how old they would be if they were human. And then we have our second candidate, Narukatome boy, also called Turkana boy, and he's a Homo erectus. Homo erectus is the sort of next step on the ladder towards us. It's a little bit closer to us. It's in the Homo lineage. And we have both skeleton and teeth. This is very exciting. So we have our teeth that fit into the lovely shark atlas, and we also have the skeleton, so we can match where the skeleton growth is to that teeth atlas to see if it's where we would expect a normal human to be, a human like us who grows in the same way we grow. So I've put a little yellow arrow. That's one of these epiphyses. These are the little ends of the bone that are going to attach firmly when the bone is finished. And you can see the sort of ball and socket joint where it's going to fit into our hip. So a human at this stage would be about 11 or 12 years old. This is all very good. We can sort of say, well, we found juveniles, and we can start to calibrate with Narukatome boy how the skeleton is growing and how the teeth are growing. But how do we know that whether they were like apes, growing fast, still with a childhood that's the same shape and size like our last ancestor with chimps, or if they're more like us? When did we get this adaptation to have the incredibly long childhoods that we have today? Luckily, we have a clock. This is the core of my research. I'm very, very interested in growth, and happily, teeth have not only this lovely regular pattern of growth, but they have microstructure. There will be no exam at the end of this. However, there are two rhythms that are recorded in this beautiful fossil that is sitting in your mouth. The first one is on the outside, and sadly, you've probably brushed it off. Adult teeth don't retain it very well, but if you ever look at a young person's very new teeth, you will see there are circumferential waves. There's little lines that go across the entire circle of the tooth. Those are growth lines, and they occur about every week. So even before we get into my stuff, which has some very fun sawing to do, just from the outside of the tooth, if we stick it in a high-powered microscope, we can get a weekly record of how long that tooth took to form. But we can also go one better. Inside your tooth, there is a 24-hour calendar. Every day that the little cells in your teeth were active, forming the beautiful white outer part of your teeth, they started and stopped and each start-stop leaves a little tiny line. You can see, if you let me have your tooth, I saw it down the middle with a very nice diamond-tipped saw at low speed. I polish it, I put it under microscopes and polarizing. There's a process. But if you let me do that, I can show you something like this glorious gray picture of a tooth, and that has in it every day that that individual was growing the enamel, and even more important, it has a timeline set to birth. Where that big red line is a scar. Something has happened to that individual that's so traumatic, growth has stopped. Other things can cause it, like fevers and other things, but we know this tooth, which is a deciduous canine, when it's about halfway, a third to halfway done, because it starts while the baby is still in the mother's stomach, when it's about a third to halfway done, the baby is born. And this causes such a disruption, it actually leaves a scar in the tooth. And this gives us something special. This gives us an absolute chronology in days. So now we can look at those fossils that we were looking at, and instead of just guessing, well, their tooth development looks like it'd be about, 6 years old or 12 years old, we can go inside. Synchrotron, very good for this. A little expensive, but worth it. We can go inside and get a daily record of growth. We can count up the days and see if fossil hominids took as many days to get their teeth to the same point humans would. What do we find out? Not at all. Further down our ancestral line, we can see that the trend was actually for a much more rapid period of growth. Childhood wasn't as long in Lucy's children, in the Australopithecines, and even in Homo erectus, that 11 to 12-year-old, once you count inside the teeth, all of that growth is happening much quicker. It's actually 7 to 8. So we actually can trace down our fossil lineage and see that this is something that humans have evolved. This long childhood is something that we've actively been selecting for, and it's come to its most extreme form, which of course is us. Here is classic primatology figure. Everyone loves it. This is before the days of color PowerPoints. So this is back in the 70s when this is how graphs were done by hand. This is a comparison of how long different living primates spend in the period of childhood. And the thing to notice is that it's just an extraordinary amount of time on the human side. It's really an incredible difference. It's a step change in how long we are children. Why? What are we doing? Why would we do this? what on earth are we doing with these super long childhoods? And the answer is easy and complicated because science. One of the things that we seem to be doing is spending a lot of time learning. This is what childhood is for. It's a period where we learn, where we play, and where we gain experience that is going to make us better adults. So childhood is, at the end of the day, when we learn to be a better monkey. But we do different kinds of learning at different times. So we've got infancy. So this is the period where you're usually with one caretaker, and usually this would be a period of direct learning. A lot of learning what your mother does. And I love these poor little vervet monkeys who researchers dyed corn different colors and made one taste good. And they taught the mother. And then her children learned, for some strange reason, you can only ever eat pink corn. So heaven forfend they ever find blue corn in the wild. They won't eat it. But childhood learning goes through different stages, and obviously these stages depend on what the child's capable of doing. So by the time you're sort of a true child, so off mom's breast and into the world, you actually have a lot more people to learn from. So being a child, not an infant who's still stuck with mom, is a great opportunity for learning to be social because you have all of these lovely people in your group to learn from. Particularly primates love something called observation and peering. Anyone who has ever encountered a child may be familiar with a sort of intent look that they are capable of doing. We are not the only primate who does this. Lots of them do. But childhood is a point where play and learning become incredibly important. And we actually can look at different species of primate and see how play fits in with their overall plan for becoming a better monkey. And it's really interesting, and I think this is a fantastic paper that talks about chimpanzees versus bonobos. So if anyone is unclear, chimpanzees and bonobos look almost identical, but they are genetically split for millions of years. Chimpanzees tend to have a sort of male-dominated hierarchy. They're quite often very aggressive. There's a lot of fights. There's competition. Bonobos tend to be led by sort of female alliances-ish, and very famously resolve a lot of their conflicts through fairly constant sexual activity, but are generally sort of often referred to as sort of the hippies of the primate world, which is unfair, possibly to bonobos. But if you look at bonobos and chimpanzees when they are children, when they are young, you can start to see a difference in what they do with those childhoods, what they do when they play. And one of the big differences is that chimpanzees play a lot as infants. They sort of play as juveniles, and then they cut right down as adults. For chimpanzees, it's not terribly safe to play as an adult because people will think you're starting a fight. Bonobos, they'll actually play as adults quite a lot, because in their society there is some level of tolerance. There is not quite the level of aggression. So how you play and when you play is extremely closely related to the kind of society that you're going to grow up in. And of course, we have different modes of transmission. Once you get to be older, a little bit cleverer, you can start to do this lovely transmission of learning through peers. Peer learning, learning things from your friends, annoying songs that you can sing on long car journeys, or in the case of macaques, extreme sports like hot tubbing. I don't know if anyone knows this story. It's one of my favorite stories, but actually, macaques only learned to hot tub. These are the snow monkeys in Hokkaido in Japan. So they now live in hot springs, but only because they were moved there. They actually were originally in sort of forest that got developed for tourism in the 50s. People were feeding them. And one of them, they actually know which one, they know the name of the monkey. She chased an apple into an onsen, a hot tub that was associated with a hotel, and she didn't hate it. She liked it. So she actually, because females sort of move around, she actually taught her children and her peers how to hot tub until, Q 75 years later, and now we have an entire species, well, subspecies of macaque in Hokkaido that hot tubs for a living. And another example is macaques washing their sweet potatoes in salt water, and one assumes inventing sort of cold sweet potato fries. And one of my favorite aspects of learning, because adolescents are very confusing for people, what exactly the point of them is a question that I believe is asked by most people who've ever been in contact with teenagers. But adolescence is an incredibly important part of the learning experience and something that actually humans are capable of dragging out for an extraordinary amount of time, not just biologically, but also socially. But adolescence tends to be the point in time where people change groups and information goes from one group of primates to another. People go off to university, or in the case of gorillas, they join a boy band. Gorillas, in case you don't know, very famous, have a silverback. Silverbacks are very aggressive to other males. So for older males who can't compete, or younger males who aren't yet ready to challenge the silverback for a harem of their own, they have to go off and live in a boy band in the forest. And that is a particular kind of adolescence. Obviously, humans generally don't do that. But we've sort of looked at these sort of anthropological sort of bits of evidence for our childhood. But I kind of want to bring it into a much more modern appreciation and understanding of what we're doing with our childhoods, because I think one of the things we often miss is that this idea that our different societies have very different childhoods. They conceive of childhoods in different ways, and children do very different things. And that is a decision that we make as a society. We do struggle sometimes to find evidence for how children and childhood sort of existed in the past. And I think this is possibly because it has not been the top interest of a field that is, let's face it, traditionally mostly just interested in Roman generals. That's not entirely fair, but there's actually a resurgence in study of how childhood in our own species in the past has existed. And what I really like, this is a lovely bit of sort of Babylonian lore. This is an adoption certificate written in cuneiform. And this is the whole text there. I won't go through it all, but it's the adoptee who's found a child and adopted him as her heir. And on the contract, it says, if for some reason she should disinherit him, then the child will get all of the possessions and she will lose everything. So it's a strict contract, recognizing how important that relationship between parent and child is from basically the very beginning of our ability to write it down. We have some very good evidence for how infants were cared for. We have evidence, for instance, of the practice of wet nursing, which is where women were paid for feeding a baby. You could earn silver shekels, four silver shekels, for food and clothing for 3 years for nursing a child. And this is a little image of a pot, and it's just adorable. So this is a baby bottle. And you pour the milk in the top, and then it sort of comes out the little deer's spout. It's adorable. Of course, we have very important information about the most critical aspect of raising a baby in the past. Where did they poop? The Greeks, of course, went for a solution similar to the Romans, actually, swaddling. So in swaddling, you wrap a baby. Very important. Leave a bit open for the bum. You'll want to change that. You want to put some moss in there or something, change that frequently. And then this lovely object, which tragically is not a very good picture, and I think I've got a better one here. This is the Stella Cacitora. This is an artifact class all on its own. It is an amazing artifact. It comes from the excavations at the Athenian Agora, carried out in the 30s and 40s. So 7th century Athens in the marketplace, and they found one of these, and they could not initially work out what it was. And then one of the female excavators, and yes, there were female excavators in Athens. There were quite a lot of them in the 30s. The records are full of women doing archaeology in all sorts of places. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, because that's my pet hobby. But here is unknown child. He's a bit upset. And Elizabeth Carlisle Camp, who is, I believe, related to one of the excavators. And the actual caption on the publication this is from mentions that Elizabeth Carlisle Camp was able to successfully demonstrate the use of this particular object, which of course is to pee in it. This is an ancient Greek potty chair. It is exactly the sort of place you might want to put a child, keep your hands free, and limit the amount of mess they're making. We actually have a vast amount of material culture related to children and childhood. These are more from ancient Greece. May not look it, but here's a rattle. These rattles were mass produced. There's a huge ceramics sort of production line in Athens in sort of ancient times, and they're mass producing these rattles. There's tons of them. And look, Here's a lovely pot demonstrating how one might sit in one of these potty chairs and shake one's rattle. We have a hard time sometimes, I think, understanding children in childhood in the past because we sort of have our own perceptions, we have our own ideas about what childhood should look like and what sort of things, for instance, might be toys, and what sort of toys different children might play with. These are corn husk dolls. I don't know if they're made in England, but they certainly are made in America, where I grew up. One of the problems with something like corn husk dolls is, of course, they're very, very ephemeral. Objects that don't, sort of aren't made of stone, bone, or pot, they disappear, they degrade. We don't find corn husk dolls unless they're trapped in amber, more or less. The Egyptians have a very nice climate. But we really don't find these perishable materials. And that is the thing that probably prevents us from seeing a vast amount of childhood in the past, because most people would have been making dolls out of, plant material, play bows and arrows out of twigs. And of course, when we do see things that look like toys to us, that's not always what they are. So this is a doll, more or less, but it's a very particular type of doll. And actually, archaeology is sometimes called upon to sort of understand objects like these. So this looks like a lovely doll that you would have as a smaller child. However, we actually know that they're mostly found with women sort of on the cusp of adulthood, or found as offerings in temples. So these are clearly actually much more ritually important than just a doll. They have some sort of social meaning as well. And this is a big question with all sorts of objects. And we really have to kind of use every archaeological skill to try and pull out, is this a special votive offering? Or is it something a child could play with? And we look to context, we look to where we found it. So one of my favorite examples is this lovely wheeled cart from Harappa, so that's Indus Valley, sort of fantastic artifacts. And of course, it was found essentially in a midden, so that's in the trash. And we know that you're probably not throwing your votives in the trash, are you? But you might throw a Harappan wheeled cart toy, especially if one of the wheels was found very far distant from the others. So to go back to this kind of idea of what play is doing, what this long childhood we're spending playing and learning is doing, we're actually learning to be the better monkeys that we have to be human, and to be humans who live in the groups that we live in. And we can see this through how different play is in different groups. So groups that have very defined gender roles might have very defined gender play in their kids, and we do see this. So there's the Bayaka group, who they're the sort of same linguistic groups and cultural group. Some live sort of more or less hunter-gatherer forager life, and some do some agriculture, sort of similar languages and things. But studies comparing the different times that people play, who they choose to play with, what kind of toys they choose, what kind of play they actually engage in, you can see that the children of farmers, whose adult lives will be much more defined by gender because their society has very strong gender roles, they engage in gendered play much earlier. And because there's a lot more work to do in agriculture, they have to sort of stop playing. They play less as they get older than the children of the foragers, who have the opposite experience. And of course, archaeology does have a variety of lovely little artifacts that are out there. That are so the top ones are whistles, little water whistles. If anyone's ever played with those, you put water in it, and it makes a lovely little bird sound. There's some sheep knuckles for all of your dicing needs, little carts, little animals, and I shall show my favorite board games. This one I particularly love because this is a site that I worked on for a long time. This is the site of Basherwick, probably site of one of the earliest human sacrifices. Nothing to do with kids, sort of. There are some young people, it's all right. This is the cemetery up in the corner. One of the things they found in these magnificent graves, and they really are just the richest thing you've ever seen in the early Bronze Age, are game pieces. These lovely, lovely game pieces, which the excavators call pigs and dogs. I always thought they were hedgehogs, but never mind, never mind. And one of the most satisfying things that has ever happened in my entire career, this was the find, and it was photographed and broadcast. It made the news. There were, journalists everywhere. And then years later, when I was on site, the missing piece! Someone found a 5,000-year-old missing game board piece, which I have to say is really as good as it's going to get in archaeology. That is as good as it gets. Thinking about this type of play and what play is for, we start to see that different societies really do have very different types of play. So we talk about foragers, we talk about farmers, and as we get very specialized careers like potter, artist, we might start to get a little bit more specialized play. And we see that children are brought into this. The Sinagua pottery that you can see here is terrible. It's awful. And it's probably made by children. One of the ways that archaeologists figure this out is going through and looking at the size of the fingerprints in the clay and working out they could not have been made by an adult. When writing and art become sort of proper careers, of course, you need to practice them. These are fantastic. These are ostraca. Ostraca is like, oh, you've got a bit of broken pot. Instead of wasting very fine, expensive papyrus in ancient Egypt, you just scribble on pots. It's good enough for practicing your letters. And you can see sort of some repeated figures here, and you can see what I'm not entirely sure what that one drawing is, but you can see that someone is clearly practicing their handwriting. Hopefully, they can go on and become a scribe. Super specialized skills for super specialized societies. So we start to see different roles for kids. These are bits of graffiti from Pompeii. We don't know that they're done by children, but one of the things that gives us a clue is the very strange perspective. Children tend to have not really understood how big things are relative to other things. And a lot of these feature animals. One of the things that might signify is that actually in Pompeii, children were doing a lot of kind of the general animal care. They could be trusted to go out, put some straw in front of the goats, maybe. And of course, it's not all play. As you get into societies that have such defined roles for everyone, you start to find children who have very defined roles. We call them work. Not all work is created equal, but here we see a particular job that was expressly for children and very old men, but usually expressly for children, which is baboon trainer in ancient Egypt. So these were little boys who'd go out with a baboon who'd been trained to go up a date tree and pick the dates, and that was a job you could have. I don't think it's still going. A lot of the sort of professions that would be open and the traineeships might have to do with religious activity. This is a lovely, lovely frieze from Akrotiri, and it's actually showing a priestess. This is the sort of saffron gatherers, so they're out gathering saffron for religious rituals, and you can tell by their hairstyles, their jewelry, and how they're depicted that these are young girls, and they are presumably going to become priestesses. They are acolytes. Of course, not all play and not all preparation for life is easy, and we certainly see this. There's a site called Hostad in Austria, which is a salt mine. It's a salt mine until very recently. It has excellent preservation because of this, but it also has a very large number of children who died and were buried there, who have really extreme damage to their skeletons because of probably carrying heavy loads. So this is absolutely something that exists in the archaeological record, is the fact that some children may be picking saffron, but of course others are very much not allowed to do that and have very dangerous and hard lives. Which brings me, I hope, to something that I really enjoyed reading about Harold Blackham when they very kindly asked me to come in and give this talk. And I thought the focus on education is such a clear and obvious one. And for me, it's something that I wrote about in my book, because, of course, education is something that we now think is an important part of childhood, is formal training. Lots of the things that I've been talking about are not formal at all. But education is something that as a society, we've picked some children who are going to be able to go off and learn this thing, and it'll make them a different class. And this years at minimum. This is Sumerian school days. This is a popular writing exercise. We actually have several different versions of this story, and I'll just paraphrase it because it's genius. It's what you have to know to understand this is essentially that everyone is speaking Akkadian at this point, but they have to do all their scribing in Sumerian. So it's exactly like having to do everything in Latin. So they all go to school, and this text goes through. I woke up early in the morning so I wouldn't be late, but my mum didn't give me my lunch on time, and then I was late coming in, and I got caned. And then my shirt wasn't tucked in properly, and I got caned. And the teacher called my name, and I didn't answer quickly enough, and I got caned. And then I was talking in class, and I got caned, and my handwriting was bad. No wonder, I mean, given the amount of times it's been caned today. And it goes on, and it is possibly recognizable to a very elderly generation of British schoolboys as well. This is the impression I get from films. But this is an extraordinary thing to do, is to have this formal process where learning happens, where we send children to become apprentices for a type of learning. And I think the thing that always sticks for me is that we don't always give all children the same chance at that. Of course, this is not the only thing that we can think about in our incredible life histories. So I talked about childhood. We take about 25 years to grow up. You've got your little collarbone, the very end of your collarbone here. That doesn't actually finish growing until you're about 30. So we are an extraordinarily slow-growing species. Another animal that has a similar childhood to us is a bowhead whale. They live like 25 years. Bowhead whales are incredibly large. It's a lot of whale to grow, and they live for something like 300 years at least. So we are spending an extraordinary proportion of our time as children. But it's not the only weird thing we do. If you look at our beautiful chart, do you slowly notice that our sort of life history coloring in bit goes past the label? We have our long childhoods, and we have this bit. What on earth is this bit? Living past reproduction. Highly suspicious. No other animals do it. Well, toothed whales do it. Narwhals, danger dolphins of all sorts. So that's your beluga, any dolphin-y thing with teeth. Basic finned toothed whales. Those are the other animals we know that have an actual menopause for females, so a chemical stop to reproduction. Even your venerable savanna elephant who lives to 70 is still producing eggs by the time she sort of goes off to the elephant graveyard. Humans and these whales stop. And this set anthropology on fire. It created something called the grandmother hypothesis. The grandmother hypothesis says that we take all of this extra time and we invest it. So just like we've taken this huge long childhood as an opportunity for first our mother, then our social group, then our peers, then different social groups around our society to invest in us, we've got this later stage of life where we're still investing, but we're just doing it one generation removed. And it's better than having a risky older pregnancy to just give all the benefit to your grandchildren. However, this doesn't leave a lot of room for non-grandmothers. There's another biological sex in our species, and then science. Always popping up. Usually when you have edits to do in your book, I had to rewrite the paperback for this. So there you go. Chimpanzees. Observations, it was reported in 2023, chimpanzees also go through a menopause. It was in the Kabale group in Uganda. After 50, chimpanzees also fully stop reproductive cycling. This is something we didn't think happened. It hadn't been observed in captive chimpanzees before this. And the thing to know about the Kabale group is that they are dumpster diving. They are eating a lot. They have a lot of calories. They are prosperous. So maybe this menopause, the other thing to know is that chimpanzees don't grandmother. They really don't care. They might care, we don't know. But they definitely don't do the kind of grandmothering of investing their food, their calories in their kids' offspring. That's not a decision they make. So they're not doing investing, but they do have a menopause. So they're living past their evolutionary sell-by date, unless that's actually where we're going. That's actually what we're doing. And one of the arguments from finding out that chimpanzees also have this whole period where they're not investing in the species might be something that we are still continually evolving. I think that makes a relatively nice flip side from the extraordinary amount of investing we have to do in our own children if we have them. And it leaves us with questions, which is good because we should always have more questions. I always have more questions. If childhood in humans is so long, and it's the period where we pour resources in, how long can we possibly stretch it out? Where are we going? Part of the reason for writing this book may have been to, understand human reproduction. It may also have been to ask the question, is it okay to move back in with my dad at 40? Jury's out. But our species has incredibly delayed reproduction. We have a delayed adult social status. You know, we are capable of reproduction long before most societies consider it to be appropriate. We often don't give adult social status or full adult social status until well past kind of biological maturity. And we use this period, particularly this last bit, for the kind of training that only our species does, which of course is formal education. We use this adolescence, this final bit where we're not really socially adults, but we're quite close to biological adults, for things like education. But we don't offer this to everybody. I always think about my grandmother, who left school at 16 and considered that to be an amazing achievement for her time and where she came from. It was. Women going to secondary school was not a thing in her family, even primary school in some cases. And of course, we used to only educate the rich, the children of the rich. We used to only educate boys. We used to only educate the classes. Then we started offering schools to more and more people. And at some point, our society flipped around and said, actually, maybe education is something you should offer to everybody. And it's so worth having, it should be free. And of course, we said that for primary school initially, and secondary school was something you didn't need if you're going to go down the mine, so why would we pay for that? And in the last couple of years, of course, we've raised the mandatory school age to 18. This is a big change, school or training. And then, of course, we have tertiary education. I have a PhD. I spent a long, long time in that. And slowly, you know, those opportunities are extending through our long childhood, but of course, not everybody gets them. If you're a schoolgirl in Afghanistan, you're finished by 11, and your society has made that choice. So I always like to think that perhaps we should think about the choices we are making as a society. And I think that's something, hopefully, that Harold Blackham would have agreed with. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening to that. And I'm going to do my little shout out for my Trailblazers project. Here are just some of the images of the fabulous, amazing women who've been in the history of my discipline and really built the stage on which I stand. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that talk, Brenna. It was really, really interesting. I've got a 9-month-old son myself, so I'm just starting to see him getting into that, really exploring and playing and watching his little brain learn, which is just fascinating. So it's really interesting to kind of think about when that really started, when our species began to have that real long period of play and learning and things. And we are now open to questions from the audience, so please do send your questions in. I just want to repeat the guidance I said earlier, so please make sure that your question is standalone and makes sense when we read it on its own, and get them in as soon as you can, because we want to get to as many of them as we can. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative here of asking my own question to start with. So you mentioned that some of our ancient ancestors had slightly longer childhoods, and then they kind of gradually got longer and longer as we got more towards Homo sapiens. Do we know what the driver was to cause that change from growing up faster to taking a longer time to grow up?
I think it's a sort of it's a very big question in evolution right now, and there's been a lot of argument about when the switch even happened, whether Neanderthals, you know, for instance, are our nearest relatives, nearest cousins, they're not quite, but when they got their life history and if they grew as fast as us, and one of the things that you can think about is growing fast versus growing slow. You tend to grow slow in a more stable environment. You'd want to shove growth really fast. If your environment is more stochastic, is more sort of like dangerous to be in, you want to grow fast, reproduce fast, and and get the next generation done. But it's possible that our species is able, through our lovely cultural adaptations, our various tools and things that we've invented, supermarkets, freezers, that we've managed to kind of level out some of that. We're omnivores, we have a broad diet and a broad ecological niche. So it might be that stability gives us the chance to grow long. But I think the really key thing is that it gives us longer to learn. We have intensely social, intensely intricate societies. And we know that other animals, even not primates, so something like a crow, crows are super social, crows are children for a long time. They're sort of adolescents forever, I think. Crows need to learn crow society, which is incredibly complicated, especially when they all look like crows. I don't know how you tell them apart. Crows can.
Does it also give us more flexibility that like our kids can learn to fit into different societies? If you move to another part of the world, they can learn new languages and all of that kind of thing. So does having this longer childhood give us a longer period of flexibility to thrive in all sorts of different environments?
Well, I think you'd hope that it really had a sort of adaptive value in giving you sort of training and opportunity in a bunch of different ways that would really kind of, prep you for being an adult human. For a long part of our sort of, species history, we were probably mostly doing very similar things in bits of Africa. But, various things changed in our lives and we sort of got all sorts of new and exciting problems to solve, like why are there so many of us? Why is it so cold here? And other things that we had to deal with. And one of the reasons that perhaps, we're able to deal with it is because we have such a long period of learning how to get along in our societies. We think actually that probably humans would have slightly larger group sizes than Neanderthals, and perhaps it's just like crows. We needed to learn a few more faces, but that gave us an edge.
Interesting. Right, we've had some questions come in from the audience, and full disclosure, this first one's actually from my dad. So, so he's asked, is the fact that adult kids are coming back to live at home after uni? And I might actually point out that I don't think I did. But many are now, and that we're often having kids and setting up our own homes later now than previous generations did. Is that a good thing in terms of evolution, human evolution?
I think you have to sort of may have to separate some of the social and economic factors behind the kind of returnee phenomenon. I mean, I certainly this was forethought in my mind when I wrote the book, because I told my dad at some point that if I was not sorted by 40, I was definitely coming back and living in a spare room somewhere, whether he had one or not. And but I don't know if it's something, if that particular mode is actually part of this adaptation of having a longer childhood.
It is almost like childhood is extending through the 20s now in some ways. We're not getting that responsibility, being a grown up with a house and a child and all of that thing often until our 30s.
I think, yeah, depending on where you live and the kind of, sort of world you live in, we are certainly giving, particularly people who have access to sort of lovely middle class lives and education, we're giving them the time to do a degree. We're giving them the time to pursue a profession. And this is kind of what I mean about that sort of education and training being for some, for people who don't immediately have to go out and work. And possibly we're finding that actually we need a much bigger investment network these days to make that happen. And if that means living with mum and dad, then that's what it means.
Well, that actually leads on really nicely to a question from Ian Du Bois, who said, can we afford to invest in a longer childhood in an aging society? And do we need to ask more of grandparents rather than using taxes to pay for childcare, for example?
Well, that one will rile some grandparents. I think I'm very much of the opinion that children are generally a public good and ought to be paid for as such. I'm a current possessor of two, so I might be a little bit biased. But I think it's interesting that we finally have evidence that this grandmother hypothesis that we held for so long is really not holding up in all species. Not all species use an extended life to go off and pour resources into children. And it might be that they're doing something else incredibly useful as well. They may be, forming learned societies or crafting things or sharing knowledge. There are a lot of things that are sort of unrelated to direct care that people could be doing, or so my parents informed me. But yeah, I think it's an interesting question how we can afford it. And I think your dad's question sort of hinted that perhaps we can't. I mean, this is why we've got kids coming back home, right?
Yeah, and the cost of childcare, I know, is a huge issue in a lot of places, and women usually weighing up whether they can afford to go back to work or whether they can afford not to go back to work. It makes it, yeah, can make it really tricky for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a question that's coming from Dawn Reese, who says, what happens to children's development, in your opinion, when they're required by, say, their home environment or school or social media or the curriculum pressure to develop in ways that don't fit their chronological age? So are we pushing our kids too far too soon? And I think one of the ways I've seen this manifest is in kind of curriculums getting younger and younger, and at what stage are we saying 3-year-olds should just be playing, or should they be learning specific things. So yeah, Dawn wants to know what's the likely impact on children.
So to reiterate, I'm a doctor of people who can no longer be helped. Um, but so my sort of understanding of the topic, and because it's a really interesting question,
Mm,
um, is that really each society chooses. We make a choice of what we want children to be, how we want them to learn, and this is not actually as arbitrary as it can sometimes seem if you start getting like key stage 1 markers on your small child's
mm,
preschool app. Um, so you sort of have an element where a society has decided um, this is the kind of thing that we need children to be doing, that the adults that we want to make need to do this as children. And I think that for individual children, of course, nothing is ever going to suit every individual child because they're humans. Like, nothing is ever going to suit every individual human. Um, and I think that's one of those things. I had a question in a completely different sort of talk a while back that I thought was a really good one, which is, are we ruining children? And it's from an American perspective. So are we, we have all these kids who they've got viola, then Mandarin, then ballet, and we're stuffing them into these hyper scheduled, hyper controlled kind of, ambitious regimes. And and my take on that is, of course, those children, um, when they grow up, their parents would like them to be the people who play viola, do ballet, and speak Mandarin. That is valuable in their society. Being able to do all of those things signals a lot of things, usually wealth, but certainly ambition, intelligence, things like that. So their parents, of course, are, it's not from nowhere that these kids are being stuck in these classes. It's because those are things we value as adults, we value in a society. So I think that perhaps all of these development frameworks and things, while we may not see um, how they fit individual children in any way, I suspect that a lot of them have to do at the core with this idea of who we want children to be when
mm.
they're adults.
I do wonder a bit if we've sort of lost sight of the value of play for children and how important that is in order to learn. And we think that children have to be doing set activities and not just allowed to kind of play anymore. But it's interesting that you say that that's maybe because those activities are more important for our society now than the kinds of skills they'd learn through free play.
Yeah, so this whole mode of I mentioned observation and curing.
Mm.
Um, this is how most animals learn. Primates, particularly primates, chimpanzees, particularly chimpanzee daughters, chimpanzee sons, very lazy. Chimpanzee daughters will sit with their moms and aunties at a termite mound, and your chimpanzees do this termite fishing thing, so they take a little piece of grass. So chimpanzee daughters learn to termite fish much better because they are paying attention at the termite mound, but they do all of this learning through peering and observation, while the sons kind of, yeah, they get it, but like they're not that interested, they leave. But this is, I mean, in chimpanzee society, this is generally the case, is that the daughters learn. It's also only female chimpanzees that hunt with tools. Um, Males don't bother. Easier just to not do that. But it's a really interesting thing that, you have quite complex tasks. So we could add things like making stone tools,
Mhm.
or anything that you could sit there and watch someone do and learn by observation. And this is actually most of human activity. Formal education, there's a lot of argument about this. What is it good for? And it tends to be something that's hyper specialized, that you
Mm.
sort of require some sort of abstract discussion for. So peering and observation, that kind of play learning,
Mm.
is something that we probably are generally used to doing a lot of, probably doing a lot of that we don't notice.
While we're talking about chimps, Savannah would like to know a bit more about the Kibali chimp group and how their calorie intake or interaction with humans might be part of that longer life adaptation.
So they're not supposed to be directly interacting with humans, but the main difference is that they have a higher calorie intake. I can't remember the figures at the moment, but it's a quite well-known paper, and if you Google it, I promise it's there. The Cabal chimps, 2023. I think it's PNAS or possibly Nature. I'm not sure. But essentially, they are near kind of like a safari lodge. And I think they are able to go in and get, into the bins and food that's left out in order to encourage sightings or something like that. So I think it's the question is that they are probably living longer because they have more calories. And this living long enough to actually go through their post-reproductive moment. So we might have a lot of chimps that have lived quite long lives in captivity. I think the oldest known was, I want to say 70 something, and passed away in Florida and had a whole obituary in the paper. But their lifespans generally are quite short compared to ours, and we haven't observed this, but if we explore their long lifespan, if they actually get to live long enough, then we start to see menopause. So this is one of the things that suggests to us perhaps what we've adapted is actually just an incredibly extended lifespan at both ends, rather than a particular focus on investing back down the line, particularly by women.
It's very easy with sort of evolutionary stuff to always be looking for a reason why, a benefit. So actually saying, well, it might not be a benefit, it might just be that our lives are getting longer because we're living healthier, is quite controversial in that kind of way.
I think the danger with all anthropology, particularly evolutionary anthropology, is that one can become Rudyard Kipling very, very quickly. Everything can be a just so story.
Absolutely.
And we have to be very wary of that habit in ourselves. And if we're not, peer reviewer number 2 will help us.
So Richard Jacks has a question about language and says, language is our most distinctive feature as humans, probably, and it enables the development of complex cultures. We know that children are much better at learning languages than adults are. So do you think the long childhood could be related to the development of language?
I don't know enough. This is more like a Ginny neuroscience question. I don't know enough about the actual specific sort of neurological development of all those really interesting sort of pathways that allow children, because as far as I understand, it's sort of you can learn a lot of really interesting things when you're young, but your brain eventually works out shortcuts and stops trying so hard.
Yeah, basically when we're born, we have the ability to learn any language, and then based on which languages we experience, our brain loses the ability to actually even hear the differences between certain sounds. So if you live in an environment where you never hear the difference between certain sounds, your brain loses that ability, and then as an adult you can never hear those differences. And that's why if you try and speak say a tonal language, if you've grown up with a non-tonal language, you can have someone repeat something so many times and be like, I cannot hear that difference. And that's because your brain basically becomes less flexible but more efficient as you grow up.
So I wonder, that's good, thank you. But I didn't get all of neuroscience completely wrong. But I mean, so this is kind of my understanding, and I think that learning language thing, because we learn it so early, and it's sort of, unless we're surrounded by multiple languages, we're probably just learning the one, and so we don't really privilege that language learning once we start going towards other types of learning, which
I wonder if the question was actually more about the evolution of language. So not an individual learning language, but did the evolution of extended childhoods coexist with the evolution of language?
Right. Oh, so that's quite an interesting. So the farthest evolutionary anthropologists would generally push back language. There are extreme opinions. Would probably be that Neanderthals had some capacity. Possibly not the full capacity, but having looked at various bones in the throat, the shape of the chest, resonance of the nose, people have come up with a variety of interesting ideas, including some shrieking or humming. languages, but I think that probably you could have the capacity for language or sort of syntax and grammar together, really probably no more than certainly after 1 million years. So only back that far would be my guess. Could Homo erectus speak? I don't know, possibly not. Bit smaller brain. So if we think that about Neanderthals and modern humans, we're built very similarly, and we probably both have the equipment mentally and anatomically to produce language. We're not necessarily sure that that's at all true for any other previous species. So our Australopithecines, our Homo erectus, probably all not speaking. And they're the ones that had slower childhoods. So it's
Mm.
possible that we're us and our Neanderthal friends, with our long childhoods, are using more of that time for language. And I would guess that, language must be one of those things, alongside all of our other social things that we need to learn to survive in our massive social societies, would be one of the things that we'd be learning in that period, we'd hope.
Interesting. We've got a question from someone who's watching in person with York Humanists, who says, do you think there's a link between the long childhood and the religious instinct?
Robin Dunbar does. No, that may not be true. I may be slandering Robin Dunbar. Probably not for the first time. But I think I think the religious instinct, depending on, of course, what you mean by that, but the sort of human tendency to have a belief in something supernatural, I imagine comes from the same very social place that the rest of our society does. That we have a sort of way of thinking about things that helps us to get along in our human societies, and one of the ways that that way of thinking lends itself to is metaphor, analogy, and why not take that into an intangible realm and have, some sort of belief system? And I think you could probably fit it in. I think I've never made myself popular in religious circles discussing this, but I don't know how much the religious instinct is something that sort of is a part and parcel specifically of our long childhood, or if it's something that just comes along with this larger social brain, social human that we have to learn to be, with the capacity for things like thinking about intangible, supernatural objects, powers, people.
We've got a question from Sam, which I'm going to paraphrase slightly, but they're asking that it seems that in certain situations, people or societies have more children, and often that's when they're in perhaps more difficult situations, or if we look historically, when perhaps the children were less likely to survive. And do you think that's a sort of instinct for you're trying to compensate for environmental risks by having more children, almost becoming a bit more like the spider and a bit less like the modern human? And does that still happen today in more difficult environments?
I think, well, the problem with children is they're very Moorish. They're lovely, really, except for when they're very, very tiny and very, very non-sleepy. That's not good. But I think so. We do actually have some pretty strong ideas about human birth spacing and how many children humans probably had for most of our evolutionary history. We know from lots of ethnographic studies, so where anthropologists have gone and looked at people who are living in different ways, in sort of recent or modern times, that people who are not doing agriculture, not living in one settled place, tend to have children about every 4 years. People who are doing agriculture, and living in one place tend to have children about every 2 years.
Mm.
And this is probably a function of social value of children as laborers, the capacity of a sedentary group to have people who look after children. I don't know if you want to take 2 toddlers into the rainforest. If your children are spaced 2 years apart, you want to carry a 2 and a 4-year-old into the rainforest, I guarantee you're not coming back with all of them. That's not true. I'm sure someone could. Probably not me. But so there's a lot of things that are basically about how we have a capacity for children to exist, and there's sort of biological consequences if you don't have your child near you for constant breastfeeding. You start to become fertile again. So if you have your child on you, what actually controls sort of fertility is basically how many times the child sucks per day. And that's what keeps your fertility suppressed. So if you have a child on you, because you're mobile, because you're moving around with that child on you, feeding them constantly, you probably reach the number of feeds per day for a long time, 4 years maybe, that keeps you not having another baby. Whereas if you are leaving a child with an older relative and only feeding them, you know, when you come back from fields, that may not give you the opportunity to suppress fertility. You might actually just sort of lose that natural fertility, natural contraception. So there's a lot in this. This is one of my I like this topic. But I think that's kind of the idea in the past, is that it's actually different lifestyles that are allowing or disallowing. And some of that is probably access to resources. So, you know, access to contraception and stuff in the modern world would be the same thing, access to resources. And I think I'm always very grumpy with Plutarch. Plutarch is a very cranky Roman writer. And he always says, you know, in the past, people just didn't care about their children. And he says, particularly of Romans, you know, if the baby was under a year, nobody cared. And we know absolutely this wasn't true. You know, there are beautiful, touching memorials to children who didn't survive. And so we look at the past sometimes with this lens of like, oh, they can't possibly have got through, you know, such a life with 12 children, 7 of whom, you know, didn't make it. And they did. It was probably reasonably tough. Agriculture is often not nice to people, but it is what allows us to get numbers up, up, up.
Right, one final question to finish on, and this is from Anonymous, but I think it's a fun one to finish on. So if you could bring back one ancient children's toy for mass production for today's kids, what toy would it be?
Whoa. So I have to say, I'm very fond of a thaumatrope. A thaumatrope. Yes, yes. So I didn't know about these until I started researching, and they are actual Upper Paleolithic thaumatropes.
Wow.
So these are something, I think it's like 30,000 years old. So, you know, Neanderthals are wandering around in the distance. Humans have just sort of crawled out to, you know, be terrified by cave bears because there are no bears in Africa. And there's these lovely thaumatrops, which is a string with a disc, and the disc has a hole that you run the string through. And the disc has 2 images either side. The one I'm thinking of particularly, that someone's reconstructed and has a video on the internet you can watch, is a gazelle that's seated or is lying down, and a gazelle that's standing. So if you pull that string taut, it goes flap, 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 and it makes an animation effect. And this is a lovely thing, and you can do it with kids and grandkids or like random visiting children. It's such a lovely thing to make.
I actually have a workshop where we go into schools and we make thaumatropes and we talk about optical illusions and how the brain works and everything. So yeah, they're one of my favorites. I'm definitely going to add in that they're that old.
They're very old.
Amazing.
They're very old.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for answering some really tricky questions. I think everyone will agree you did a great job. And as I said during the introduction, the Blackham Lecture and Medal are named after Harold Blackham, the first executive director of Humanists UK and a famed educationist. And the medal is awarded to someone who's made a significant contribution to the field of education, childhood, or lifelong development. Now, we should actually have a real physical medal for you, Brenna, but unfortunately, the courier still has it. Should have been delivered yesterday, but for now, you'll have to make do with this beautiful mock-up that you can see on your screen. Once the medal does arrive with Brenna, she's agreed she's going to share some photos with Humanists UK and on her Blue Sky profile as well, so that we can all see how beautiful it looks with you. So for now, I am delighted to virtually present Brenna Hassett with the 2024 Blackham Lecture Medal for her remarkable contributions to understanding and explaining what makes us human. By exploring the evolution of human childhood and the profound connections and interplays between the natural world around us, the cultural forces that shape our species, and our own individual development. A powerful reminder of how deeply rooted we are in the shared story of life on Earth. So huge congratulations, Brenna.
Thank you so much. I'm just incredibly honoured, and I think it's lovely that that this legacy exists and that I get to be a tiny, tiny little part of it. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, both online and at Humanist UK's local group live screenings. As I said at the beginning, tonight's event is the last in the Humanist UK's 2024 annual lecture series, but announcements about the Darwin Day lecture and the Rosalind Franklin lecture in February and March 2025 will follow soon, so keep your eyes peeled for those. And on the 11th of December in London, and now with live stream tickets available as well, is an event to mark the launch of the new book, What I Believe, with Natalie Haynes, Professor Alice Roberts, and chaired by Andrew Copson. So do have a look at that. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic event. If you're looking forward to the next summer already, and aren't we all, given the way the weather is at the moment, the Humanist UK convention will be heading to Sheffield in 2025. It'll be on the 13th to the 15th of June. The 2024 convention was a massive success, selling out months in advance. It's always a highlight of the Humanist calendar, a summer festival of humanism. Early bird tickets went on sale on Tuesday, and already almost 200 humanists from across the UK have signed up, based purely on its reputation and the testimonials of previous attendees. We've been really blown away by the enthusiasm we've seen for next year's event already, and we really hope you'll join us there. There are just 7 early bird tickets still available. 7, you've got to be quick. So book yours now. Details about all the Humanist UK events, including the 2025 convention, are available at humanists.uk/events. So all that's left for me to do now is to once again thank all of you for coming. I've been Ginny Smith, and to thank and congratulate Brenna Hassett once more. Let's all give her a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again at another event soon. Take care. Have a good evening.